Like the most controversial textbook in Japan, it was this middle school textbook called the new history textbook, the Atarashi Rekishi Kyokasho, which was put out by this very conservative publisher. I mean, it was a group that got together specifically to write a conservative history textbook because they considered the mainstream history textbooks in Japan to be much too liberal and, affected by the left leanings of the Japanese Teachers Association and all of these what they consider to be these pernicious left-wing influences on society. The fact is the Japanese history textbooks are actually published by private companies, but then they're regulated by the government. There's an office in the Ministry of Education that goes over the private textbooks and can ask them to make certain changes. So they have this back and forth process of editing where both the more left-wing textbooks and this very controversial conservative textbook go through the editing process, and both of them have had some of the more ideological elements sort of worn down by the editing process, and they both end up a little bit more mainstream. The difference is not so much having false information in the textbooks. I wouldn't say that even this very conservative right-wing textbook had a lot of really inaccurate information in it. It's more what's left out. What things do they not discuss? So they don't mention, things like the Nanjing massacre or the comfort women issue. They don't talk about minorities in Japan very much, and that sort of thing. And so this is somewhat different from the colonial period, when the only textbooks in use in these areas were written by the government. So there was only one textbook, and it was written specifically to promote the nationalist agenda and a certain view of history. And so they're very careful in choosing which historical figures were included and how they use them to promote a certain idea of Japan as this ancient country with an unbroken imperial lineage going back 2,600 odd years to the sun goddess and this whole thing. I think it's sometimes blown out of proportion, certainly, but it definitely causes problems as well. I mean, most people mostly know about history based on what they get in their primary and secondary school history textbooks. So to have things left out completely does cause quite a big problem, I think. And I haven't studied this in great detail, so I don't want to get too much into it, but actually, let me talk briefly. There's one very, very controversial incident a few years ago when the textbook committee asked the textbooks in Japan to remove references to the incidents in World War II when the Japanese army was forcing Okinawan residents to commit suicide before the American army came in. And this is a very well-known piece of history that's especially well-known in Okinawa, in which, children or women were handed grenades or lined up on cliffs and more or less ordered to commit suicide before the American army came in, who they were told were going to murder children, rape women, and just generally act like savages. And thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Okinawans killed themselves under direct military pressure at this time. And this was going to be edited out of the textbooks, and it caused one of the largest protests in Japan in recent history. I think tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 Okinawans protested, and it was such a controversial issue that eventually this was reversed, because, I mean, these are the national textbooks, and the Okinawans were, I think, rightly very upset and concerned that their own history as a sort of minority in Japan, having been originally sort of colonized by Japan before being fully integrated into the country in a legal sense, that their own local history was being kind of whitewashed in favor of this sort of unitary state narrative that's become standard. So that's the biggest example of a domestic issue that's been controversial in the textbooks, but certain international issues like the Nanjing massacre and the comfort women, the military sex slaves during the World War II period, have also been very controversial. But that's been more protested by neighboring countries, especially China and Korea, and to some degree Taiwan and the Philippines are also areas that were affected by these comfort women policies, and they were also protesting about having this included in the books.